The question nobody dared to ask room was quiet, except for the faint hum of cameras and whispers behind the stage. It was a warm afternoon in Mumbai, and the auditorium was packed with reporters, students, and curious onlookers. Everyone was waiting for Sundar Pichai to take the stage. He had flown in from California just for this one talk, and tickets had sold out in less than an hour. People came not just to hear about technology, but to understand the man himself. The boy from a small house in Chennai who became the CEO of Google. Sundar walked in wearing a simple white shirt and black trousers. No bodyguards, no dramatic music, no grand entrance. He carried himself with calm, almost invisible energy. His eyes scanned the crowd, and for a second he smiled shyly. The applause was loud but short-lived because everyone was eager to hear him speak. He began softly, almost as if speaking to a single person instead of hundreds. He talked about his childhood, sharing one bedroom with his parents and brother, waiting years before his family could afford a telephone, studying under dim lights when electricity failed, standing in long lines just to make a single call. Yet he spoke of those days not with bitterness, but with gratitude. You could see people nodding, moved by his humility, but about 10 minutes into his talk, just when everyone was settling into his rhythm, something happened. A young reporter at the back raised her hand, holding a small notebook and looking nervous. Sundar stopped mid-sentence and gestured for her to speak. She stood up slowly, her voice shaking. "Sir, what is your biggest regret in life?" For a moment, you could hear nothing but the buzz of the air conditioner. The question hung in the air. No one had ever asked him that so directly before. Certainly not in front of cameras. Not in a room this full. Sundar's face did not change, but his eyes looked far away, as if she had unlocked something he had carefully kept hidden. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed his hands on the podium and leaned forward slightly, his lips pressed tight. "That," he finally said, "is a very good question." Then he surprised everyone. He sat down on the edge of the stage, looked straight at the reporter and said, "If you really want to know, I'll tell you a story." The audience fell completely silent. He began speaking about the summer before he left India for the United States. He had been accepted into Stanford. It was a dream come true. But it was also the day his father came home, looking more tired than usual. His father handed him a small envelope with the money for the plane ticket, which he had borrowed from relatives and friends. Sundar said he could still see the strain in his father's eyes, the quiet shame of asking for help. That night, Sundar said, his voice low, "My father sat alone in the kitchen after everyone went to bed. I wanted to go to him. I wanted to tell him how much it meant to me. But I didn't. I thought there would be time. But the next morning he left for work before I woke up." The reporter's eyes widened. So did everyone else's. Sundar paused, swallowing hard. "I boarded the plane the next day," he continued. "When I called home weeks later, he sounded happy, but he never mentioned that night. And neither did I. I regret that silence more than anything. Because I never got the chance again." Someone in the audience gasped softly. Sundar looked down at his hands and smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened. "So, to answer your question, my biggest regret is not saying the words when they mattered." The reporter lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. The room was heavy with emotion, but then, just as everyone thought the story was over, Sundar added something that made people sit up straight. "What's strange," he said slowly, "is that I received a letter from him years later. A letter that changed everything I thought I knew about that night." And then he stopped. He looked at the reporter and said quietly, "But that is another part of the story." The room erupted with murmurs. What letter? What did it say? Why had he never spoken of it before? Sundar stood up, adjusting his sleeves, and looked over the crowd with a mysterious smile. "Perhaps," he said, "if you're patient, I can tell you tomorrow." With that, he walked off the stage, leaving the entire audience holding their breath, desperate to know what was written in that letter and why it changed his life forever. Asterisk the letter nobody expected the next day. The auditorium was full long before Sundar arrived. People were already standing in the aisles, leaning against walls, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Some clutched notebooks. Others held their phones ready to record every word. The atmosphere was electric, but also uneasy, like everyone was holding their breath. Because no one had come today just to hear about business or technology, they had come for the letter. They wanted to know what was written in those pages that had haunted him for years. When Sundar finally appeared, he didn't walk straight to the podium. Instead, he paused at the entrance for a moment, scanning the crowd slowly, as if weighing their faces. The same young reporter from yesterday sat near the front now, her pen already poised, her eyes unblinking. Sundar's lips curled into the faintest of smiles when he saw her. He stepped forward, but instead of standing tall behind the podium like before, he pulled out a chair and sat at the very edge of the stage. The room immediately went quiet. He held something in his hand, a small worn envelope that looked older than it should have. Edges yellowed and soft from being opened too many times. Even from the back, you could see how gently he touched it, as though it might crumble if he held it too tight. This, he began, his voice low, and even was the last thing my father left me. And it took me many years to understand what it meant. Then he told them everything the night before his flight to America. After his father had handed him the borrowed money and sat alone in the kitchen, Sundar had kept his distance. He told himself that his father was proud of him, that his silence was strength. But the truth, as he would later realize, was that his father had been struggling with much more than anyone knew. In the years that followed, Sundar wrote letters home. Long letters at first, full of stories about California, about the strange taste of cafeteria food, about how the streets smelled of rain even when it didn't rain. But his father's replies were always short, polite, formal even, and never mentioned that night in the kitchen. Ben, one morning, a phone call came. Sundar was working late at Stanford, buried in homework and barely eating when his roommate tapped him on the shoulder. The news was simple but devastating. His father had fallen ill, suddenly. Within weeks he was gone. Sundar flew home, but everything felt like a blur. The funeral passed with neighbors and relatives saying things like he was so proud of you, and he never stopped talking about your success. But no one, not even his mother, spoke about that night, and Sundar didn't ask. He stayed in India for a few weeks, trying to help his mother settle things. One morning, while cleaning out his father's old desk, he found the envelope. It had been tucked away at the very back of a drawer, under some receipts and faded photographs. His name was written in the front in his father's neat handwriting. At first, Sundar said, I couldn't bring myself to open it. I kept it in my pocket for days. I even thought about leaving it unopened forever. I was afraid it might tell me something I didn't want to know. But one sleepless night, he finally unfolded it. He paused here, looking down at the envelope in his hands now, the very same one he had carried all these years. The audience leaned forward, as though they could somehow read the letter through his fingers. His father's words were simple, but they shook him to his core. My son, it began. You are leaving tomorrow, and I do not know how to tell you what is in my heart. So I write it here because I fear if I speak I will cry, and I do not wish you to see me that way. You have been my greatest pride, but also my greatest worry. I have borrowed money for your ticket, but that is not what hurts me. What hurts me is that I have borrowed time from you. Time that I should have spent teaching you more about life, about patience, about kindness. I see now that I was too hard on you sometimes, thinking I was making you strong. But last night I sat alone because I did not know how to ask your forgiveness. You have given me more joy than I ever gave you in return. If you remember only one thing from me, let it be this. Do not let silence stand between you and the ones you love. Speak, even when it is hard. Because silence is heavier than words. By the time Sundar finished reading those words aloud to the audience, his voice had grown so soft it was almost He held the paper delicately, as if it still carried his father's warmth. The reporter in the front row had tears in her eyes now. Many in the crowd did. And Sundar, for the first time in his life on a public stage, let the silence stretch long and unbroken, letting them feel what he had felt. Finally, he said, I spent many years trying to earn respect from the world. But I learned too late that I already had it where it mattered most, and I never got the chance to say thank you. He stood up slowly, folding the letter back into its envelope and slipping it into his jacket pocket. Just as he seemed ready to leave, someone at the back of the room called out a question. Did you ever forgive yourself? The question cut through the air like a knife. Sundar froze. His shoulders stiffened, and for a long time he did not turn. Around. Finally, with his back still to the audience, he spoke. I thought I had, he said quietly. But then I received another message years later that made me realize forgiveness is not always ours to give. He walked off stage before anyone could ask what he meant. The crowd erupted into whispers and their minds spinning. What other message? Who sent it? And what did he mean about forgiveness not being his to give? The young reporter stood motionless, clutching her notebook so tightly the pages crumpled. She knew she couldn't leave until she learned what came. Next. And neither could anyone else. The message that changed everything. The auditorium was still buzzing after Sundar left the stage. Reporters huddled in corners. Students whispered to each other. And the young reporter from the front row sat frozen in her seat, staring at the empty stage. Her pen rested on her notebook, forgotten. Outside, the sky had turned heavy with clouds, and the air smelled like rain. People lingered in the corridors, hoping Sundar might reappear. No one could stop thinking about his last words. I received another message. Years later, that made me realize forgiveness is not always ours to give. The reporter finally stood, walked slowly toward the exit, but stopped when she saw a thin man in a gray suit waiting by the door. He looked at her as if he'd been expecting her. If you want answers, he said softly, come back tomorrow, same time. She opened her mouth to ask who he was, but he had already slipped away into the crowd. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay awake in her tiny hotel room, listening to the ceiling fan whirring, staring at the faint outline of the envelope she had drawn in her notes. She kept hearing his words in her head. Forgiveness is not always ours to give. And for the first time she wondered, maybe the story wasn't just about a letter from his father. Maybe there was something or someone else. The next day. The air was thick with tension even before Sundar arrived. The seats filled faster this time, and security had to turn people away at the door. Everyone could feel that something important was about to be revealed. When Sundar appeared, he looked different. His white shirt was slightly wrinkled, his eyes darker, his smile more forced. He walked straight to the podium this time. No chair, no envelope. For a moment, he just looked at the audience, scanning the faces like he was searching for someone. Then he spoke. You have all been patient, he began, and I owe you the rest of the story. He gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles pale. Years after my father passed, after I had already become CEO, I was invited to give a speech in a small town in Tamil Nadu. It was supposed to be just another talk about technology. But at the end, when most people had already left, an old woman approached me. She was small and frail with gray hair tied back and eyes so sharp they seemed to cut right through me. He paused, closing his eyes for a moment. The reporter leaned forward in her seat. She handed me a note, just a single folded piece of paper. And she said only this, you don't know the whole story. The crowd stirred, restless, uneasy. Thought she was mistaken, Sundar continued. But then she whispered my father's name. He opened his eyes, and the weight in them was enough to silence the room. She told me she'd known my father long before I was born. She said he was not the man I thought he was. She said he had left someone behind. The words hung in the air like thunder. People in the audience exchanged confused glances, some covering their mouths in shock. I opened the note when I got back to my hotel. He said, it was not from her. It was from my father. A second letter written years after the first, but never sent to me. She had kept it all those years, waiting for the right time. He took a breath, and for the first time his voice faltered. In that letter, My father confessed he had once been engaged to another woman before marrying my mother. But he had abandoned her when his family arranged his marriage. And the woman who gave me the note was that woman's sister. She said my father had spent his life regretting what he did to their family. He had written the letter to me, hoping I would someday find her and make things right. A hush fell over the crowd, heavy and suffocating. No one moved. He wrote, Sundar said, his voice breaking slightly. If you find her, tell her I am sorry. And tell her son that none of this was his fault. At this, the room seemed to freeze. The reporter's pen slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. She felt her pounding in her chest. She understood now his father had another son. Somewhere out there was a brother Sundar had never met. I thought I had forgiven myself for the silence that night in the kitchen, Sundar said. But this was different. Because forgiveness for what he did was not mine to give. It belonged to someone else. Someone I didn't even know. He stepped back from the podium, his hands trembling slightly. For years I searched. He said, and when I finally found him, it was nothing like I expected. Then he stopped, looking down, his jaw tight. The reporter couldn't take it anymore. She stood up abruptly, her voice trembling. What happened when you found him? She called out, her words echoing off the walls. Sundar looked up at her slowly, and in his eyes was something no one in the room could name. Something between grief and hope, between shame and love. When I found him, he said softly, he already knew who I was. But he wanted nothing to do with me. The room gasped. Even the camera seemed to hesitate. He continued, his words heavy, deliberate. He said to me, you are too late. The silence that followed was deeper than any applause. No one moved. No one breathed. Sundar stepped away from the podium, his shoulders sinking under the weight of everything he hadn't said yet. Then, just before disappearing behind the curtain, he turned back and spoke one last time. But that wasn't the end, he said, almost to himself. Because the last thing he said to me was a question I can never forget. And with that, he was gone, leaving behind a room full of people desperate to know. What was that question? What could have been so powerful that even Sundar Pichai couldn't forget it? The young reporter sat back down, her hands trembling, her notebook now full of questions instead of answers. She knew one thing for certain. The story was far from over. Asterisk, the question that broke him at night. The young reporter could not sleep. She sat by her hotel window, watching the monsoon. Rain poured down over the city. Neon lights reflected in the puddles. Horns blared faintly below. And yet, all she could hear were Sundar's final words, because the last thing he said to me was a question I can never forget. Her mind raced through possibilities, but every answer she imagined felt too ordinary for the weight in his voice. She knew tomorrow he would speak again, and she knew she had to be there, not just as a journalist, but as someone who had started to feel part of his story. The next day, the crowd was even larger. People stood outside in the rain just for the chance to hear him. Some brought umbrellas. Some just stood soaking wet, their eyes fixed on the doors. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Whispers rose and fell like waves as everyone waited. When Sundar finally appeared, he walked in more slowly than before. His shoulders seemed heavier, his steps more deliberate. He no longer carried the envelope. He no longer looked at the crowd. Instead, he went straight to the podium, placed his hands flat on the wood, and stood silent for a long time before speaking. I know you have questions, he began, his voice low and rough. So do I. He looked up then, and for the first time, his calm facade cracked. His eyes were tired, red at the edges, and his lips pressed tight as though holding back something dangerous. The first time I met him, Sundar said, I thought I was ready. I thought I could walk into his life, explain everything, and he would understand. But nothing prepared me for what I found. He took a breath, his fingers tightening on the podium. He was living in a small village by the sea. He worked as a fisherman. When I arrived, he was mending nets on the shore. At first, he didn't even look up. I introduced myself, but he already knew who I was. He didn't seem surprised. He just kept tying knots in the net, his hand steady, his face unreadable. The reporter closed her eyes, imagining the scene. Sundar, standing on a windswept beach, trying to find words while the waves crashed behind him, and a stranger quietly mended his nets. I told him everything. Sundar continued. About the letters, about our father, about how sorry I was. I told him I wanted to make things right, but when I finished, he finally looked up at me, and he asked me a question. Sundar stopped here, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the crowd, his breath unsteady. The room was so quiet you could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. He looked me in the eyes, Sundar said, and he asked, "Do you even know who I am?" The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The audience stirred, confused, unsettled. The reporter frowned, writing the words in her notebook, but feeling like she didn't understand them at all. Sundar continued, his voice heavy. At first I thought he meant it rhetorically. But then he spoke again, slowly, carefully, as though each word cost him something. He said, "You came here thinking you're the one with answers. But you never even bothered to ask me who I became when he left. You don't know my name. You don't know my story. You only came to ease your own guilt. So tell me, do you even know who I am?" A murmur swept through the room. Sundar let it wash over him. His shoulders slumped. He was right, Sundar admitted. I didn't know. I had been so focused on what I needed to say that I never asked what he needed to hear. I stood there silent while he shook his head and went back to mending his nets. And the worst part was, I couldn't answer him. I couldn't even say his name. The weight of the confession settled over the crowd like a heavy fog. The reporter could feel her own throat tightening. I left the beach that day, Sundar said. But his question followed me. It still does. Because even now, after all these years, I still don't know if I can answer it. And I don't know if I deserve to. He gripped the podium tighter, and his next words were barely more than a whisper. I don't know if I ever will. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one dared to move, as though the entire audience was holding its collective breath. Then, Sundar straightened, letting his hands fall from the podium, his face suddenly hard to read, somewhere between pain and resolve. But, he said, his voice growing steadier, he left me with one more chance. Because before I walked away, he handed me something. Something I haven't opened yet. He said, if you want to know who I am, open this when you're ready. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. The edges were frayed, the fold lines deep and worn. He held it up so the audience could see. This, Sundar said, is what he gave me. I've kept it all these years, but I've never had the courage to open it. He looked at the reporter then, his eyes locking with hers, as though challenging her to ask the question everyone was thinking. And she did. Her voice cracked as she stood and said, "Will you open it now?" Sundar smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. He turned the paper over in his hands, staring at it for what felt like an eternity. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "Maybe it's time." And just as he began to unfold the paper, the lights in the auditorium flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, and someone shouted for the lights. In the faint glow of phones and emergency lights. The stage was empty. Sundar was gone, and the paper, the one everyone had been waiting to see, lay unopened on the podium. Fluttering slightly in the draft. The reporter stood frozen. Her heart pounding, her mind screaming with questions. What was written in that paper? And where had Sundar gone? She knew only one thing. She had to find him. And this time, she would not let silence win. Asterisk the chase through silence. Auditorium was chaos. The lights sputtered back on a few seconds later, but Sundar was no longer. On stage, the little folded paper still lay there, untouched, and yet no one dared to pick it up. Some people in the crowd shouted his name, others stood frozen, whispering to each other, as though afraid to speak too loudly. The reporter stood still at first, her breath uneven, her eyes locked on the podium. Something inside her told her that whatever happened next would not wait for her to think. She had to move now, or the story and Sundar would slip through her fingers forever. She grabbed her notebook and rushed toward the stage. The guards tried to stop her, but she ducked under their arms and climbed up, her fingers brushing the paper. It felt warm somehow, as though it had been held tight just moments before. She slipped it into her pocket, not daring to unfold it. Yet, she looked toward the side curtain just in time to see it swaying slightly. She ran toward it, pushing through the heavy velvet fabric and into the dim backstage hallway. The air back here was cooler, the light faint and yellow, the sound of the crowd now a dull hum behind her. She stopped and listened. Footstep, faint but hurried, somewhere ahead. She followed them without hesitation. The hallway twisted and narrowed, lined with old posters and crates of equipment. She caught flashes of movement ahead, a dark silhouette turning a corner, a brief glint of a white shirt sleeve. "Mr. Pichai," she called out, her voice breaking the silence. But there was no answer. She kept running. Her shoes clicked against the concrete floor, her chest burning now, her breath ragged. At the end of the hallway, she saw a door swing shut just ahead. She pushed through it and found herself outside, in an alley behind the auditorium. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet. Puddles glistened in the dim streetlight. And there he was, Sundar, walking quickly down the alley, his shoulders hunched, his hands buried in his pockets. She hesitated for only a second before calling his name again. Louder this time, he stopped. Slowly, he turned his head. Even in the half-light, she could see how tired he looked. His eyes were shadowed, his face lined with something heavier than fatigue, as though the years had finally caught up to him all at once. "Why did you leave?" she asked, stepping closer. "Everyone is waiting. They want to know what's in the paper. I want to know." He looked at her for a long moment before answering, his voice quiet but steady. "Because some truths," he said, "cannot be spoken in front of a crowd." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. He turned and kept walking. And after a moment's hesitation, she followed. They walked in silence through the narrow streets, past shuttered shops and glowing windows, where families gathered for dinner. The world felt smaller here, more intimate. The kind of place where secrets could be told without fear. Finally, he stopped in front of a tiny tea stall, its walls faded, its wooden sign hanging crookedly. The owner, an old man with kind eyes, nodded at Sundar as though he knew him. They sat at a corner table. The owner brought them 2 cups of steaming chai without a word. Sundar wrapped his hands around the cup, but didn't drink. Instead, he stared at the table, his jaw tight. "You're very persistent," he said after a while, glancing up at her. She smiled faintly. "I have to be. I need to know the end of the story." He shook his head, a shadow of a smile on his lips. "There's no end. Only choices. And I've been running from mine for too long." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a second piece of paper, not the one from the stage, but another, smaller and more worn. He placed it on a table between them. "This," he said, "is what he gave me that day on the beach. The one I never opened." Her breath caught in her throat. "Then open it," she whispered. He didn't move. His fingers hovered over the paper, trembling slightly. "Do you know why I left the stage?" he asked, his eyes still unfolded. "No," she shook her head. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid that whatever is written here would prove him right, that I don't even know who he is, that I don't deserve to know." She leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "You deserve to know, and so does he." He finally looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes melted, revealing something vulnerable beneath. He nodded, slowly, as though coming to a decision. Just as he began to unfold the paper, a figure appeared at the entrance of the tea stall. Both of them froze. It was a young man, lean, with the same sharp eyes as Sundar, the same quiet intensity. He stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his hair, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The reporter's heart skipped a beat. She knew immediately who he was. Sundar did too. His breath caught, his hands falling away from the paper. The young man stepped forward, his eyes locked on Sundar's. "You finally decided to come," he said, his voice low but steady. Sundar swallowed hard. his voice barely audible when he replied, "I didn't know if you would be here." The young man's lips curled into something. "That wasn't quite a smile. You still don't know, do you?" he asked. Sundar shook his head, his shoulders sinking. "No, I don't." The young man stepped closer, his eyes dark with something the reporter couldn't name. Anger. "Grief, maybe both. Then open it," he said. "And when you do, don't look at me until you understand." He turned and walked back out into the rain, leaving the door swinging behind him. Sundar sat motionless, staring at the little folded note on the table. The reporter could see his hands trembling now, his breath coming fast in shallow doubt. She reached out and placed her hand gently over his. "You're not alone," she said softly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with something deep and wordless. Then, very slowly, he unfolded the note. The paper shook in his hands as he read. His lips parted slightly. His eyes widened. And then, to the reporter's shock, he let out a sound that was almost a laugh, but broken and hollow. He dropped the paper on the table and pressed his palms to his face, his shoulders heaving. The reporter picked up the note and read the first line. It said, "You came all this way to find me. But what you needed to find was never me at all. It was the truth you've been running from. So here's my question to you." And then just below it, scrawled in the same sharp handwriting, "Who are you, Sundar?" The reporter looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. His hands fell away from his face, and for the first time, his eyes met hers, wide, wet, and full of something that looked a lot like fear. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know who I am anymore." The reporter sat back, her mind spinning. The note lay between them, the question hanging heavier than anything she'd ever heard. And outside, through the open door, the young man was still standing in the rain, waiting. Asterisk. The truth we carryth note lay on the table between them, its words burning into the quiet air of the little tea stall. "Who are you, Sundar?" The reporter could feel her own heart beating faster, her breath shallow. She had been chasing this story for days, but now it felt like it was no longer just his story. It was everyone's. Sundar sat still, his hands resting on the table, his eyes fixed on the door where the young man had vanished moments ago. The question in the note seemed to weigh on his shoulders like an anchor. Outside, the rain fell heavier, streaking the windows and filling the silence with its steady rhythm. What does it mean? The reporter finally asked, her voice low, almost hesitant. Sundar blinked, as if startled by the sound of her voice. Then he let out a long, unsteady breath and spoke without looking at her. "It means," he said, "that all these years, I thought I was fixing something. I thought I was making it right, but I was only running from myself." He stood suddenly, pushing back his chair. The tea stall owner glanced at him, but said nothing, just watching quietly as if he'd seen this before. "Where are you going?" the reporter asked, rising to her feet. He didn't answer. He just stepped outside into the rain, the door swinging shut behind him. She hesitated for a moment, then grabbed her notebook and followed. The street outside was almost empty now, the storm turning the night into a blur of silver and shadows. Sundar walked quickly, his white shirt clinging to his back, his shoes splashing through the puddles. Ahead of him, barely visible through the rain, was the young man standing perfectly still at the end of the street, his hands in his pockets, waiting. The closer Sundar got, the more he seemed to shrink into himself, not physically, but in some quiet way she could feel even from behind. His pace slowed. His head lowered. Finally, he stopped just a few feet away. The young man looked, his eyes catching the faint light from a street lamp. They were sharp but not cruel, the kind of eyes that held more questions than answers. Neither of them spoke at first. The rain fell between them like a curtain. Then Sundar said softly, "You've been waiting for me all this time." The young man tilted his head slightly, then replied in the same quiet tone, "No, I stopped waiting a long time ago. I just wanted to see if you'd ever find me." The reporter stayed back, watching from under the awning of a clothes shop, her pen forgotten in her hand. Sundar's shoulders rose and fell as he struggled to speak. I came because I thought you deserved the truth. The young man's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, or maybe just a shadow of one. Truth? He echoed. You still think this is about truth? Sundar blinked, confused. Isn't it? The young man stepped closer, the rain running down his face, and shook his head. You don't understand, he said, his voice breaking just slightly. I didn't need you to bring me the truth. I already knew it. What I needed was for you to see me. Not as some mistake our father left behind, not as someone to forgive or pity, just as me. The words hit Sundar like stones. He opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly fell open. The young man's gaze softened, just a little. You came all this way, he said, but you still don't know who I am. Do you? Sundar shook his head, his throat tight. Then let me tell you, the young man said. He stepped even closer, their faces just a foot apart now. I am the boy our father abandoned. I am the man who learned to live without him. I am the fisherman who mends his own nets, not because he has to, but because no one else ever did. And you're not my savior, Sundar. You're just my brother. The last word hung in the air like a prayer in a wound all at once. Sundar's breath caught. For the first time, he looked at the young man, really looked, and what? He saw there was not anger, not hatred, but a quiet, aching dignity. The reporter pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. She understood now why Sundar had been running. Because he had not been running from his brother. He had been running from himself. Sundar took a trembling step closer. The rain ran down his face, mingling with the tears he didn't bother to hide anymore. I don't know who I am, he admitted, his voice hoarse. But if you'll let me, maybe I can start by knowing you. The young man studied him for a long, heavy moment. Then, without a word, he reached out his hand. Sundar stared at it. The hand of the brother he had never known. The hand of the man who carried all the silence and pain he had once ignored. And slowly, almost reverently, Sundar reached out and took it. The reporter let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The two of them stood there in the rain, holding each other's hands. Two strangers who shared the same blood. Two men who carried the same regrets. And no words were spoken after that. The look in their eyes said everything. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but something better at a beginning. The reporter closed her notebook slowly and stepped back into the shadows. She knew this was not the kind of story you finished writing. It was the kind you carried with you, quiet and heavy, like the rain. As she turned to leave, she glanced back one last time, and there they were, still standing in the storm. Two brothers finally seeing each other for the first time. She smiled faintly to herself, whispered under her breath, "We are all just trying to find who we are." And then she walked away, leaving them there, two silhouettes against the dark, with the rain still falling and the world just beginning to heal. Asterisk.